Hello, and thank you for joining our Teaching for 21st Century webinars brought to you by the Glazoff Gang and David Horowitz Freedom Center. I'm your host, Annie Cyrus. Please use the Q&A box on your screen if you have any questions. And I am extremely honored, privileged, and excited to introduce our guest tonight. He is Dr. Charles Jacob. He is the president of Americans for Peace and Tolerance. Dr. Jacobs, what an honor to have you tonight.
Well, thank you very much, Annie. I'm always glad to see you, and I'm especially honored to be on anything that David Horowitz does. It's magnificent.
Absolutely agreed. Before we get us started on your presentation, would you please kindly tell our audience a little bit about yourself?
Well, okay, for the purposes of this discussion, my story is rather simple. I've been at this for about 31 years, trying in a variety of ways to do what Jewish leaders and others have failed to do. That is to protect and defend the Jewish community, also to fight for human rights of people oppressed in the Muslim realm, and finally to fight for America as well. It's clear to me 31 years later that Israel is just the first target of a left Muslim alliance, the Red-Green Alliance, now fully emerged from the shadows, whose ultimate goal is the destruction of liberal society. And so what that means is that defending Israel and the Jews, as many non-Jews now understand, is key to saving what's left of Western civilization. And Jewish leaders who fail to defend their community and their people are betraying everyone, not just the Jews. So I can quickly just give you a brief background of what I've done, and that will, I think, enable us to go forward. So in 1989, I co-founded the Boston branch of CAMRA, Committee for Accuracy in Middle East Reporting in America, to expose and combat what was an emerging media bias against Israel. In 1992, I launched the American Anti-Slavery Group to educate Americans about the enslavement of Blacks by Arabs and Muslims in North Africa, still going on. In 2002, I co-founded the David Project with my partner, Avi Goldwasser, to train Jewish students in how to defend Israel on campus. And in 2008, Avi and I and Ilya Feoktistov founded the Americans for Peace and Tolerance, where we continued all of these fights, but added Islamic Jew hatred to the mix. So it's clear to me that if Jewish leaders were doing what God put them on the earth to do, I would have had a very different, more relaxed life. But among other blessings, I got to know the best of the best people of our people in these fights, including David Horowitz, and I'm very grateful for that. So I've got about 20 minutes to tell you what I think is the most important story that's missing from the news. So let me do highlights and themes. I imagine that our listeners here already know that the American Jewish community is under ideological and physical assault, that every Jewish building in America, every Jewish institution in this country now needs security. Jews have been murdered, assaulted in the street. Jewish buildings have been stormed with gunfire. Crimes against Jews, according to the FBI, are more than 60% of the crimes against all religious targets. Against Muslims, it's about 15%. You could see videos of Jews being assaulted in the streets of New York almost every week, sometimes twice or three times a week. So politically, the Jews are rapidly losing power and influence. They've lost half of the Democratic Party, the energetic and surging half, and that's because we've lost in many key precincts of American life the ideological war against Israel that started in the media and on the campuses a few decades ago. Jewish students and the only few Zionist professors left on campus, and now also non-Jewish conservative students, are currently under social media mob attack. Syracuse is the most recent example. In Boston, here right now, we're about to file suit against a prominent Massachusetts university whose administrative staff incited students to physically attack a conservative Jewish student. Stay tuned, that's going to be a big story. Anti-Israel curricula, now standard fare in college classrooms, has been rapidly spreading in the public and private high schools under the guises of peace studies, conflict resolution, or merely history. And I haven't even mentioned yet the Jew hatred taught in America's mosques or the bias against Israel in the liberal churches. So Jews are in the vortex right now of a perfect storm. We have 4 external enemies: the right, the left progressives, the Islamists, and the Farrakhan-led black Jew haters. And we suspect they're all coordinating their assaults, we know. And this, meanwhile, while the police are being put in handcuffs. I would say the situation is appalling and even dire. Look, we can't determine what our enemies will do to us, will try to do to us, but surely what we should deal with and what we can deal with is the failure of our own leaders. So as these assaults mount, the Jewish defense and communal organizations seem to me to be like deer in the headlights, paralyzed or worse. None of them has a strategy that makes sense. No one has a plan that makes sense. And I'm here talking about the big Jewish organizations, the Jewish federations, the Jewish community relations councils, the American Jewish Committee, but most importantly, the biggest Jewish defense agency, the Anti-Defamation League. The leaders of these institutions have not understood, or they willfully ignore and refuse to understand, the nature and extent of the ideological assault against our people. So here is, in our view, how the once powerful Jewish community is being brought low. First, we all need to understand that there emerged a new form of anti-Semitism. Call it what you like: anti-Zionism, Palestinianism, anti-Israelism. It should not have been surprised that a new form of Jew hatred emerged, because that's the way it's always been. The Jew hatred virus morphs predictably, like this. In each epoch of history, anti-Semites accused Jews of committing that particular sin that is most hateful in that time. So when religion guided society, the Jews were charged with deicide. When nationhood was seen as the best way peoples expressed their virtue, Jews were cursed as stateless people. When race theories were seen as true markers of value, Jews were portrayed by Nazis as racial vermin. And today, when nationalism is a sin and globalism is the highest virtue, the Jewish state, Jewish nationalism, is the main target. Israel became the Jew of nations. This should have surprised nobody. But many Jews, reading the New York Times, misread the New York Times hectoring of Israel, thought about it as legitimate criticisms of Israel's policy. And this was the enormous error, because it was an assault. Here's how to tell, I think, the best way if something is anti-Semitic. Alan Dershowitz tells this story as a parable, and I think it's a really important teaching point. So it turns out that in the 1920s, Harvard's President Lowell, who wanted to restrict the number of Jews admitted to Harvard, told his board that Jews cheat, Jewish students cheat. Well, a prominent jurist by the name of Learned Hand answered him, and he said, well, Protestant students cheat too. And Lowell said to him, you're changing the subject. We're talking about the Jews. That's the key. Why are we talking about the Jews? What explains the obsession with Jewish behavior compared to the relative indifference toward the conduct of other peoples? It works like this. Why, Mr. New York Times, are you talking about Israel? So Israel has a wall you don't like, and you write about that a lot. Its enemies call it an apartheid wall, and you publish that phrase in your paper too, a lot. But you know, There are 24 other walls across the globe, barriers that separate people who are in conflict. And you, Mr. New York Times, hardly ever write about that. It seems Jewish walls matter to the New York Times. Here's another trick. The media focuses on the Palestinians who have been killed by Israelis. So much so that it has now become a cause that pulls the heartstrings of decent people. But actually, between 1987 and 2014, about 8,500 Palestinians were killed in confrontations and violent confrontations with Israelis. But millions of Arabs and Muslims have been killed in conflicts that don't even involve Jews. Millions, many millions. And they have been killed by Arabs and Muslims. So if you think, by the way, that the phrase Black Lives Matter is a new thing, meaning to point to only certain Black lives that matter, because only by certain their deaths caused by only certain people, this was all preceded. This is not new. It was preceded by Palestinian lives matter. Certain lives matter. Certain Arab lives matter, only if killed in conflict with certain people. Jews were that certain people a long time before white cops became that certain people. So to do this trick, you have to ignore, to do this trick that is to focus on Jewish behavior, which is the fundamental definition of, to focus critically on Jewish behavior, which is the fundamental definition of anti-Semitism. You have to do something else. You have to ignore the many Arabs and Palestinians and Muslims who were killed by people who are not Jews, just as you have to ignore the many Blacks who have very sadly been killed by Blacks in America. So if you can't recognize the emergence of this new anti-Semitism, this focus on Israeli behavior as a new form of anti-Semitism, you cannot defend the Jews. So I'm going to tell you a key point, what I think is a key point in American Jewish history that I don't think anyone else has identified. In 1989, Andrea Levin and I were preparing to launch Camera to fight media bias against Israel. Suddenly, as we were about to form the organization, we were approached by two very important people close to ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, who asked us not to do it. Let ADL do it, they said. Let ADL be the ADL for Israel. That was the phrase, and I recall it vividly. Why, we said? Because, they argued, if it was the ADL that told the public, that told the world, that the New York Times and the Boston Globe and the Washington Post and the LA Times were cheating on the Jewish state with their false reports and their hyper concentration, and they're ignoring the really awful things in the neighborhood, in Israel's neighborhood, that would really matter, because the ADL speaks in the name of America's Jews. They were right, and we agreed with them. But after some consideration, the head of the ADL at the time, Abraham Foxman, declined. I don't know exactly why. I suppose he needed his letters to be published in the New York Times for fundraising purposes. I suppose he didn't want to upset any of his left-wing donors who agree with him about hectoring Israel to make it a better place, of course. But I do posit to you that the exact moment that the ADL decided not to speak in the name of the Jewish community against Jewry's biggest defamers at the time, the mainstream media, which was trumpeting lies and slander, the minute that the ADL refused to say to the American public that the media was lying about the Jews, that marked the beginning of the decline of American Jewish fortunes. And it was at that moment a vacuum was created, and then wonderful Jewish activists, some of the best people we have, seeing that the community was abandoned by its leadership, tried to fill the void by creating the organizations. They tried to stick their finger in the dike that could not, as we see today, hold back the flood of Jew hatred. After Camera came the David Project, Stand With Us, Hasbara Fellows, and many, many more. The Zionist Organization of America, ZOA, was always there. even before that. Mort Klein is the one national leader, by the way, who has no problem saying the truth about this, that Jewish leaders have failed the community, and I salute him. AIPAC, of course, was always there, but its mission was to lobby Congress for Israel and not to fight anti-Semitism. Defending the community was the mission of the well-funded, powerful ADL, which has now been, by the way, taken over by a former Obama consultant. I kid you not. Next phase. So uncontested in the media in any serious way, anti-Israelism moved to the campuses. In 2003, Avi Goldwasser, my partner, whose films many of you have seen and should see, went with me to secretly meet Jewish students who told us, who cried out their hearts about how they were being harassed and intimidated in New York City at Columbia by their professors in class and out of class whenever they challenged the anti-Israel lessons or readings. So we went to the ADL and we told them. Nothing happened. We went to David Harris, head of the American Jewish Committee. And he, by the way, is probably the most eloquent of the establishment Jewish leaders. But he told us point blank, we don't do campuses. We do diplomacy. Well, in a generation or two, he would be having to deal with diplomats poisoned on the very campuses he didn't do. Jewish students were shocked when they came to campus. They were totally unprepared and undefended to deal with anti-Israel arguments and anti-Israel forces. By the way, next to Jewish leaders, college administrators may be the most cowardly officials in America. Without pressure from our leaders, college deans and presidents and administrators could easily bow to the forces arrayed against us. And there were many. It was the professoriate, the leftist student groups, the media, the Black and Latino radicals, the communists, and later the Muslim students, who, organized and well-funded, could create pain for the administrators, which the Jewish leaders didn't want to do and didn't do. Avi Goldwasser made a film called Columbia Unbecoming. It's a classic. Interviewed there are the students who described painfully how they were being bullied. We made the film. We thought the film could wake up the Jewish community. That was in 2003. You can find it online. It woke up a few, but it didn't create the change that we wanted in the sentiment of the Jewish leadership, of national Jewish leadership, who had the power and the money to act, to help the kids, to stop the assault. And now, from 2003 to now, it's 100 times worse. And I can tell you that if not for the pandemic, I'm sure we'd be seeing assaults on Jews on campuses from coast to coast. Next, Hamas came to Boston to establish a base. That's right. They set up shop. Boston's Jewish leaders cowered. An Islamist group pretending to be moderate Muslims created the largest mosque on the eastern seaboard in Roxbury, Massachusetts, on the outskirts of Boston. On their board was, among others, Yusuf Qaradawi. Now, Qaradawi is the spiritual leader of the Muslim Brotherhood. You can, with 3 clicks on your computer, you can see him exclaim to masses of Muslims in Cairo or online that every Jew in the world must be killed. He was coming to Boston to build a big mosque. The main organizational head of the Islamic Society of Boston was Abdul Rahman Alamudi, who in 2004 was sentenced to 24 years in jail for financing Hamas. So these were the fellows who were going to build the largest mosque in Boston, and their mission was to radicalize the historically moderate Muslim population in our city. We did our research. We had it dead cold. We had every fact. We called a meeting of Boston's Jewish leaders. the Federation, the JCRC, the American Jewish Committee, the ADL, and we showed them who these people were who were coming to Boston to do this. They clearly represented a direct threat to the Jews of Boston and to the general public. So they told us that we didn't understand, that we needed to be inclusive. We needed to support diversity. We needed to encourage interfaith dialogue. The head of Boston's Federation, Barry Schrag, came to my house to watch on my computer the speeches of Kara Dowie, calling for the death of all the world's Jews, and who was now likely to guide Boston's Muslims. I showed him how Al-Amoudi was an operative. I showed him how the same fellow named Walid Fatahi, who was reaching out to the Jews for their support for the mosque project, had written Jew-hating screeds in the Arabic press. And in response, the head of Boston Jewry said to me, "Charles, you want me to fight a Jewish jihad?" "No, Barry," I said, "just go to the mayor, who we have supported, and tell him not to let those folks have a major institution in the hub. Tell him not to subsidize the purchase of land for the mosque," which they did. We got nothing. Moral confusion, delusions, cowardice. And now we found the curriculum taught in that mosque. My executive director, chief of research here, Ilya Feoktistov, is a brilliant researcher. He found the curriculum. It's the Muslim version of Nazi hatred. And now 14 people connected with that mosque have been either killed or on the run from federal authorities or are in jail. The Boston Marathon bombers were congregants, Barry. We've been hectoring Boston's Jewish leaders and pleading with them for years to stop giving Islamists a kosher stamp, which is their key to the city, right? Because if the Jews say that this bunch of Muslims is okay, well, if the Jews have the most skin in the game, obviously it must be true. Welcome. Finally, we hectored our Jewish leaders. We made fun of them, we mocked them, we humiliated them, including a rabbi who allowed radical Muslims to come to his congregation and raise funds, mind you, funds that were certainly meant to harm Jews. So now finally, after all of this work, frustrating as it is, the JCRC and the ADL have withdrawn from their very public embrace of that of that mosque and its leaders. You should know the story. Ilya, my executive director, documented this entire episode of Jewish in Boston history in his recently published book, Terror in the Cradle of Liberty. The book names names, more than I have here, shames the shameful cowards among Boston's Jewish leadership. It's on Amazon. Terror in the Cradle of Liberty. Finally, the public schools. So the left and the Muslim organizations have learned to insert pedagogically correct anti-Israel curricula in the public schools. It's part of the anti-Western push by the left and by the Muslims. And they're doing quite well. So Israel, American school kids learn today, is not so great. The Arabs, of course, are wonderful, and Islam is the religion of peace. So we have here probably the most famous fight about this. We're in Newton, Massachusetts. We've been fighting to correct this. They didn't want to give us the teaching materials. We had to issue FOIAs to get teaching materials that are paid for by the public. But we did. We're fighting this. And guess what? The Jewish Federation and the JCRC and the ADL told the mayor of Newton, Massachusetts, that we were wrong, that there was no problem with the curriculum. So we cannot win outside a lawsuit, which just may happen. Stay tuned. So in sum, America's major institutions, the media, the campuses, the high schools, I didn't even mention the liberal churches, the mosques, and now a big part of the Democratic Party believes and promotes an anti-Israel narrative, which includes an attack on American Jews and others who support the Jewish state. This can only be seen as a catastrophic defeat. Apart from the apart from the ZOA, we are, I think, practically the only group that feels there's a moral imperative to tell this story, to tell the Jews and the general public about the failure of our community's leadership. We have placed ads in 16 Jewish newspapers and Commentary magazine explaining this failure and describing what real leaders should be doing instead. So I think for questions about why they do it, why do they act this way, and to maybe discuss Vladimir Lenin's question, what is to be done, I think I'll leave that for the Q&A. Okay?
That sounds great. I'm pretty sure everybody will have that question.